Hello everyone, welcome to the first lecture for Chapter 19, Europeans Explore the East. As you can see on the picture for this slide, you can see that it's focused on India and the European settlements that are there. We'll talk a lot about these, but we'll also talk about several other places as well, so we're not going to be limited just to India. So let's get started. Alright, so when the Europeans started to venture out to explore, there were several reasons, but the two biggest reasons that they actually focused on for exploration were riches. They wanted wealth, in really any form. Obviously, gold and silver were well coveted, but other forms of wealth were much appreciated as well. And then to spread Christianity. And why they were able to start this exploration and expansion was there were a lot of advances in sailing technology that we're going to talk a little bit more about here in a second. And then also, they were really trying to get into, going back to the sources of wealth and goods, they were trying to get into the new market of the spice trade and other luxury goods that were coming from Asia. And the idea of supply and demand was great at the time. They wanted those sources. The demand was really high. Supply was less, so you had high prices, high profits. And then also, you had middlemen that were in control of the trade going back and forth from Asia to Europe, with it being Muslims and or Italians, and they were charging they were able to charge higher prices, and the other Europeans were trying to find ways to bypass these two so it would be cheaper for them and more profitable to get these resources. Now, one of the other issues too, specifically with the Muslims and societies in the Middle East being the middlemen, is that you had hostility created between Muslims and Christians because of the Crusades and those differences as well. Now, another goal, and we kind of already talked about this, of exploration for the Europeans, is that they wanted to Christianize or spread Christianity. And the whole idea is that they wanted to get God, glory, and gold. Those would be their three objectives. Excuse me. Now, in terms of technology, some pieces of technology that were really helpful in allowing them to explore and expand, one was a ship called the caravel, and you guys can see a picture of it here on the slide. It was a much sturdier form of ship, which made it better to go across oceans and so forth. It used lateen or triangle sails, which meant that it could sail against the wind, so you didn't have to really worry about the wind in which direction it was coming from. And then the other two important innovations or inventions at this time were the astrolabe, which was brought over from contact with Muslim sources, which allowed them to track latitudes so they could tell where they were on the globe. And then the magnetic compass, which came from China, which would also allow them to track their direction. So you had much better ways to actually move and explore more effectively coming out of this period. Now, we're going to kind of talk about Portugal and Spain as our main focus today, but we'll talk about the Dutch and a little bit about the English and the French as well. But to start off, in the age of exploration, Portugal is really going to become the leading innovators in this stage for Western Europe. And really, it's all because of three things. And one is they have strong governmental support throughout for their exploration. Two, to kind of go off of that strong governmental support, Prince Henry, who's going to get the name the Navigator, is really going to kind of push through that government support, and a lot of things are going to come to fruition by him establishing a navigational school, as well as funding other projects to help the Portuguese gain a foothold or gain a lead in this exploration process for Europe. And then the third part is they had trading posts already set up in Africa, which was easy for them given their proximity in the east to actually get to North and West Africa, where they're located. Now, what ends up happening though is after Henry dies, European trade with Africa does start to take off. In various forms, it's obviously over certain luxury goods, gold, ivory, The slave trade is actually going to take off here in this period, and eventually morph itself into what we're going to know as the Atlantic slave trade and so forth later on. But really, this is all kind of the starting of the building blocks to actually have Europeans make their way by water to the Asian markets. Now, the two most important Portuguese explorers for this purpose of the Europeans trying to get to East Asia are Bartholomew Diaz, who you can see on the left, and Vasco da Gama, who you can see on the right. And their goal, obviously, was to reach Asia, like we've talked about, and you guys should know. But they thought the best route was to sail around the tip of Africa. As you can see, you can see their routes there in the map at the bottom of the slide. Now, Diaz, he reaches the tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, but he has to turn back for a variety of reasons. Ships need to be repaired, they're running low on supplies, as well as some other things that we won't get into. And then Da Gama, he ends up rounding the Cape of Good Hope, and then using the east coast of Africa and various trading cities that are already established there, which we've talked about earlier in the course, as well as monsoonal winds, to make his way to various places across the East African coast and then eventually across the Arabian Sea and then reaching the Indian port of Calicut. And this is important because this is really the first Western European link by water to Asia. In this case, it's the Portuguese setting up this trade route with Indian groups. Now, Spain, Portugal's rival on the Iberian Peninsula, they're very envious of these advancements and these accomplishments that are going to be achieved, have been achieved by the Portuguese. So they're setting out and trying to find ways to actually say, look, we can do this too. And at this time for Spain, it's really important. They're going through a huge transition. In 1492, the Reconquista is happening. Ferdinand and Isabella are have won the fight to push Muslim forces out of Spain, and they've retaken all of the Iberian Peninsula outside of what's controlled by Portugal for Christianity, Catholicism. And at the same time, Christopher Columbus comes to them, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, he says, hey, I have this idea, and to try to get to Asia, and they want this because they see what the Portuguese are doing, and they say, okay, look, let's do this. It's really a low risk for them. It's not very expensive for the King and Queen of Spain, but it's high reward if it is successful. And as we all know, Christopher Columbus, in the first of 4 voyages he's going to take, he reaches the Caribbean. And this is going to change the world immensely, and it's going to set up the modern world that we have today. And we'll talk more about this specifically later on, so I won't go into too much detail here. Now, this is going to set up a very, very rich, lucrative system in the New World for Spain, and they're going to earn a lot of money and posterity over this. But again, more on that later. Another important Spanish venture that's funded is by the King and Queen is funded for Ferdinand Magellan's voyage, and he is actually going to undertake the voyage that is going to be the first voyage to actually circumnavigate the globe. Now, this is going to lead to a variety of things that are going to happen. One, Spain is going to be the first European country, actually the first people in history that we know of, to be able to circumnavigate the globe. 2, it's going to lead to Spanish colonization of certain areas, in particular, as you guys can see on the screen, Spanish claims in the Philippines in 1521. And then the other part of it is that you need to know is Ferdinand Magellan's actually not going to live through this entire voyage. He will die in the Philippines fighting some natives, and only a few of his men on one ship will actually get back. But they do complete the circumnavigation of the globe. And here you guys can see a quick map of Columbus's voyages to the so-called New World, opening up contact between Europe and the Americas. And then here's a map of Magellan's voyages. And you can see he started out in southern Spain, made his way down to what we now call the Straits of Magellan at the southern tip of South America, all the way over to the Philippines. Spain's going to claim this, Magellan's going to claim this for Spain. He will die here, and that will stay in the hands of Spanish colonization until the Spanish-American War, when it will switch over hands to the United States. And then they make their way back to Spain. Now, Spain and Portugal, this rivalry is going to explode through all this exploration. It's has other issues that cause problems as well, but that's for another time and a different course. But as all these explorations are going about, in particular once the Spanish ones take off and start claiming land, you start seeing tensions between the two, and you're seeing Portuguese claiming lands that might have been Spanish and vice versa, and it leads to certain problems. And Spain's not in a position to actually fight Portugal on the seas because Portugal has a much stronger navy and merchant fleet. So they actually go in and ask the Pope at the time, Pope Alexander VI, who was of Spanish origin, to negotiate several agreements of peace. And this all leads to what's going to be known as the line of demarcation. And ultimately in this line, they decide west of the line, Spain will get those territories, and then east of the line, Portugal will get those. But as this is going on, it's not necessarily known exactly where this line is. There's a little bit of wiggle room. You don't have modern technology and, all that stuff to tell us exactly where it is. So the Portuguese start kind of pushing the line, and it leads to another set of meetings where they have to negotiate, saying, look, Portugal's like, hey, this line's hemming us in too much, and some people believe they actually knew where Brazil was, and some people believe that they didn't, and kind of tricked the Spanish, but ultimately in the 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas, Spain and Portugal actually moved the line westward, so Portugal gets more room for its ships to maneuver, but this line is actually going to run through the middle of Brazil, which allows them to lay claim to a significant portion of South America. And they ultimately agree to honor this line between the two. Now, you guys can see on the map here where the Treaty of Tordesillas actually runs. There's going to be further negotiations with other that are going to come about because of other explorations, in particular Magellan's circumnavigation of the globe, as you guys can see here, where they have to agree to the Treaty of Zaragoza, which splits it again, and kind of says, okay, this is where your half of the globe is. And as you can tell, most of the Portuguese land is east of the Treaty of Tordesillas line and west of the Treaty of Zaragoza, and then Spain's is the opposite of that, with the exception of a couple of areas here and there. Just a few more. So Portugal's trading empire is going to just be very, very lucrative for them in the beginning. One, because when Da Gama's voyage opens up Indian Ocean trade, they're the only Europeans that really have control of that. Now, there's various other groups as well from Africa and Asia that are part of it, but they're the only European group. So, but they have the use of cannon, or use it very effectively on their ships. So they're actually going to use that ability to take control of the spice trade from the Muslims. So they're actually going to cut out the middleman and break this domination of Eastern trade from the Muslim states and the Italian city-states. So that brings them even greater wealth because they can almost act as a middleman for most of Europe, at least for a short time until the other powers get into the game. But as they start to expand into this network of trading, they control several key strategic points that even if you were to control today, you'd control significant sources of trade wealth. One is they capture Goa, which, as you guys can see here, is on the west coast of India. That's going to be their trade capital. It gives them a base in Asia, right in the center of the action. The second thing is in 1511, they're going to control the Straits of Malacca, which is one of the foremost trade networks, trading points in the world, and you can kind of cut everything off and control that trade that's moving from East Asia to the Indian Ocean if you control the Straits of Malacca. And they're going to use that to tax and move things through. And then they control the Straits of Hormuz, which are right up here, which lead into the Persian Gulf, which again really is vital in them cutting the trade off or breaking the Muslim domination of the Eastern or Asian trade coming into Europe, because they're controlling a huge waterway that's the entry point for those goods into the Muslim world in most cases. All right, now we're going to move on to the Dutch and kind of start wrapping up this lecture here with just a few more slides. Now, the Netherlands, they're going to enter the fold. They're a very small nation in Northwest Europe, as many of you guys know. But by about the 1600s, they are able to develop the largest merchant fleet in the world. It's over 20,000 ships, and they're going to start to threaten the Portuguese trade network to East Asia just through sheer numbers. Even though they're a small nation, they're well known for their navigational and merchant abilities, and they slowly take over the trade that the Portuguese were able to establish earlier, as we talked about. Now, they form a private company, corporation called the Dutch East India Company, that is going to direct their trade efforts in Asia. Now, through time, we don't have enough time to go through all this in detail, but we'll go through some things quickly, is they're actually going to take over those key strategic positions we just talked about. Many of those positions that the Portuguese are able to control, the Dutch are going to take them over. Like you guys see here on the screen, the Strait of Malacca. They're going to gain control of most of Indonesia and actually going to control that until after World War II. So they're going to control that land for a long period of time. They're also going to take control of the Cape of Good Hope. So they're really going to have the controlling interests on both ends of the Indian Ocean trade, at least both southern ends of the Indian Ocean trade with Southern Africa and Indonesia. And that is going to allow them to do the same thing that the Portuguese were able to do in terms of taking over that trade network. And again, here, as you saw with the Portuguese, here's a map of where they actually controlled. You can see just how far everything is from where they are. So Amsterdam's here, Cape Town down here at the southern tip of Africa, Gale and Ceylon, which is going to be their central base of operations in the Indian Ocean trade, and then you have their base here in the Dutch East Indias with the Strait of Malacca and their capital of Batavia. So you can see they have that control, and they can go anywhere they want within this basin, and it's going to lead to a lot of riches and trade wealth. All right, and then just to finish up, we have two latecomers to the game, and we'll talk more about what these two do later on in the course. But Britain and France are going to become big players on the world stage. Now, Britain is going to have much more of a role here in East Asia, particularly in India, than the French, mainly because the French aren't going to send huge numbers of people, and they're going to lose some fights to Britain later on. But Britain will actually take control of the entirety of India, at first using the East India Company of their own, which is very similar to that of the Dutch, and they're going to take control of all of India and use that as and it will become actually their crown jewel of their empire eventually. And really, this is kind of what we're looking at the stage of about 1700 in terms of when things are switching over. So as we started this lecture, we saw that about in 1400s, Portugal and Spain and many of the Europeans are looking for ways to get to Asia, get to those sources of wealth, expand their control, expand Christianity. And in those 350 years or so, we're seeing that Portugal and Spain have come to dominate in various parts of the world. Spain will dominate more in America, and Portugal, obviously, in East Asia, as we're talking about here. And then the Dutch slowly come in and control the East Indian or Indian Ocean trade. And now we have, right at the end, Britain and France getting into the game. So this is just kind of opening up the beginning struggles of expansion, exploration for the Europeans and what will ultimately become colonialism and imperialism in the future, in the decades to come. All right, guys, have a good day.